So before I begin telling my own story, I wanted to begin with the scripture that has inspired this year's Lenten Lunch series of Conversations in the Wilderness. So Jesus, he's baptized before he starts his ministry by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. And as he's in the waters, what we hear in Scripture is that the clouds open up, the Spirit descends like a dove, and we hear the voice of the Father calling out, saying, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And then right after this happens, Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. And so this is how Jesus prepares for his ministry. He goes into the desert alone, so that he can reflect and prepare. And this, what Jesus does, is meant to be a model for each and every one of us. That when we receive a new call from God in our lives, we should take the time to prepare. Now, I ended up doing something like this in my own call to ministry. However, it was less to prepare and more because I was trying to figure out what had just happened. So in my call, this was back when I was 15 years old. And I was fortunate enough to go on a pilgrimage. This was led by the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama. Those of you who aren't Episcopalian, think of the Episcopal Church like one giant megachurch. And we are just various branches of that one larger ministry. So each of our churches a part of a whole diocese. And ours here in Alabama had this pilgrimage for young people. And it went for 1 week to various places in England. And for another week to a small community in Taizé, France, which is, if I get my geography right, is southeast of France. That's kind of the area, you can find it on the map. And it's a monastic community there, and I'll be talking a little bit more about Taizé and that experience later on. But first, in our England portion of our trip, as we were towards the end of this journey, we went to Winchester Cathedral. Beautiful place. Look it up if you haven't heard of it. And Winchester is known for a lot of different things. There's a lot of claims to fame for it. One of the immediate that might perk your ears up is it's the place where the author Jane Austen is buried. But our main reason for going there was another claim to fame for the cathedral. One of their bishops, Saint Swithin, who's a little-known saint, although you'll sometimes hear of circles that are really fond of Saint Swithin, and for good reason. One of the legends about this bishop is that he was going across the bridge in Winchester one day. And there's this young woman, who's got a basket of eggs. And there's workers who are working on this bridge. Now, these workers are not very kind people, and they're harassing this poor woman, which makes her drop her basket. And so, as you would expect, basket falls, the eggs break. St. Swithin, according to this story, reaches down and helps her with the basket and picks one of these eggs up, and miraculously it is healed. So instead of being broken, it's now been made whole. So in this spirit of being made whole, in this spirit of healing, we held a reconciliation service at the cathedral at Winchester. And it was during this, one of our leaders, Bishop Mark Andrus, Bishop Andrus at the time was our bishop suffragan, which is a fancy term for a bishop who helps the diocesan bishop with the roles and functions of the bishop, basically to help lead the diocese and to also be a pastor to everyone in the diocese. That includes the laity as well as those of us like me who are clergy. So this is Mark Andrus's role at the time. He'd later go on to be Bishop of the Diocese of California. But during this time, he was one of our leaders on this pilgrimage. And as part of that role, he was one of the folks helping lead this reconciliation service. So each of us would go up to him or to one of the other priests there, actually including Rob Morpeth, who was one of my predecessors at St. Paul's in Greensboro. And I remember going up to Bishop Andrus, and what he said to me, the words that sort of began this part of this reconciliation, was, "What is it that you seek?" And as he asked that to me, before I even thought about it, before I really had time to think of an answer, I just blurted out, "Am I to be a priest?" So this was a pretty distressing revelation at the time. I had a few people in the past who had suggested this as a career, but I had sort of pushed it out of my mind. Ministry wasn't something that I felt God was calling me to. And my sense at the time was, if you're going to serve God ministry, you better have a call from God to go and do that. I was, however, interested in Scripture and studying it and learning more. And so I had thought, well, maybe doing something in theology, the study of God is what that word literally means. Maybe that would be something that I would do. But I wasn't thinking at the time about ordained ministry. It wasn't something that I knew I was thinking about. So this came out of the blue for me. And so I really didn't know what to do. This was one of those what just happened moments in my life. Now, fortunately for myself, I was thoughtful enough at the time to realize that something had just happened and I needed to figure out what it was. And even more fortunately, fairly soon after this occurred, we moved into the Taizé part of the pilgrimage. Now, as I said earlier, Taizé is a place in France. It's actually a monastic community. And even more specifically, it's an ecumenical community, which is a fancy word to say that the brothers who are there in Taizé and the folks who can come in and be there and stay in Taizé are folks from just about every denomination. In fact, the founder of Taizé, the late brother Roger, he's Lutheran. And in fact, he came to France back in World War II to help with the Jewish refugees who were trying to escape oppression in Nazi-occupied France. So this is the setup for how this monastery, this ecumenical community got started. Now, those who have heard of Taizé, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is the music. That's one of the things that Taizé is very well known for. And so when people come up and I mention I've been to Taizé, they'll usually be, oh yeah, the music. And the music is a part of it, and it's a large part of Taizé, but it's not the only part of what goes on there. And it's not really what usually comes to my mind first when I think of Taizé. So the pattern of life in Taizé is really centered around prayer. In fact, every meal of the day either begins or ends with everyone going into the chapel and doing morning, afternoon, or evening prayer. What this usually entails is you've got some singing. Again, that is important, the music. But then you often have some scripture that's read. And then there's a period of silence. And that period of silence comes after these scripture readings. And then you've got some more singing after that. And then sometimes, particularly for the evening services, you'll have a time after the service where you can just stay in the chapel in silence and think and reflect. So, this environment that's filled with prayer, this is really the perfect thing, the thing I needed at this point. Because it forces you, particularly those periods of silence, to stop and to reflect, and often to listen. And that's where the scripture is really important too, because you hear the scripture being said all around you in various events going on, but particularly at these services. And so that gives you something to stop and reflect on, and to really be there, present, to listen more fully to what it is that God is trying to say to you. So again, this was the thing that I needed at this time, was to be able to stop and listen and figure out what it was that God had tried to say to me back when we were in Winchester. And even at Taizé, I had moments that added to my thinking. Another part of the life that surrounds your time in Taizé are small groups. Places for reflection, for thought. And in one of these small groups, it was clear to people that I had an interest in Scripture, maybe that I had some knowledge of Scripture. And one of the folks in our small group, whose father happened to be an ordained minister, asked me at one point if that was a path that I was thinking about going on, a path to ordained ministry. So these events kept happening, giving me more things to have to think about. And then another part of the pattern of life in Taizé are the workshops. There are various workshops that the brothers there will lead. And one of the ones that was particularly helpful to me, that still stays in my mind to this day, was a workshop on discernment. It was led by a young brother, probably somewhere in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. This was a young guy. He had the choice before he entered the community of Taizé. He had the choice either to accept that call or to continue doing what he was doing, which was coaching an athletic team that was getting ready to go to the Olympics. So big choice that he had there. One of the things in this context that he said to us was that God always asks us to give something up when he calls us to his service. But when we end up following him, when we end up making that choice to follow him, when we have that thing that we have to give up, we get back so much more in return. So I ended my time in Taizé with a lot of questions still. There was still a lot of reflection that I had to do. And I came to the conclusion at this time that I was too young to be thinking about these sorts of things, that I was too young to really figure out what God was doing and to figure out if he was calling me to greater service in ordained ministry. And yet, when I returned home, this place, Taizé, was still with me. The contemplative spirit I'd cultivated in my time there, that remained with me. And so did the thoughts about my call, the call I'd received at Winchester to start thinking about ordained ministry. And so, in spite of my thinking I was too young, the thought of that call continued to stay with me, continued to work in me. And as I thought and reflected and let this sit with me, the sense that God indeed was calling me grew stronger and stronger, which is how I ended up to where I am here today. So what I would like to leave you all with, I would like to encourage all of you. At some point, either this year or at some other point in your lives, take the time to stop and reflect. It's not that you'll necessarily receive the answers that you may be seeking right away, but stopping and thinking, that reflection, it will make you more open to listen to what it is that God may be calling you to do, what God may be offering to you. A period of quiet will, at the very least, help prepare you for the next stage on your journey. Wherever it is that God at this point wills to take you. Thank you.